So recently, we have witnessed the complete breakdown of the Leftovers podcast. And for those of you who don't know, the Leftovers podcast is a political podcast hosted by two hosts, H3H3's Ethan Klein and Twitch streamer Hassan Piker. The show is presented as a political podcast, where Ethan and Hassan go over the significant political events of the week and add their coverage to it. And recently, both of these hosts have started to clash on and seemingly off air about their coverage in relation to the events happening in Israel and Palestine right now. These clashes have gotten very intense as of late, and as far as we know, as of the filming of this video, Leftovers is cancelled, with very little prospect of it coming back. But this video isn't going to address any of that. No, we're not going to do that. So I'm instead going to cover where this breakdown in Hassan and Ethan's relationship really began. And that was in Leftovers episodes numbers 57 and 58. The majority of our discussion will be based around 58, but there are a few smaller points that we will look at from 57 later on in the video. Now, in these episodes, the show covers foreign policy topics with a great deal of depth, which is a rarity for the show, as typically, Leftovers is only focused on US domestic politics, with little commentary on foreign affairs, with the exception of a single episode they did one time on Ukraine. The topic of socialism versus social democracy is also discussed in episode 58, which was prompted by a discussion with Ethan's producer Dan on another H3 show. Now, throughout both episodes, Hassan makes a number of terrible arguments, which I feel are important to cover here and push back on. Now, Hassan's currently the largest leftist political streamer online, largest leftist content creator, in fact. And as such, he has a large amount of sway on current discourse. And his audience takes much of what he says at face value, and lately is being increasingly radicalized by his words, particularly around Israel-Palestine. Now, due to this, and the fact that a lot of what he says on foreign affairs topics is borderline tanky nonsense, I feel that it is important to provide pushback against his narratives. Now, I do have more personal motivations here as well. I actually used to be a fan of Hassan, and it was through him I discovered H3H3. So when this episode came out, I was sitting here pulling my hair out in frustration. Now, Ethan does the best he can, right? He's not fully educated on these topics, and unfortunately he's got the additional handicap of assuming that Hassan is still his friend, which he isn't. So as a result, Ethan can't really give the kind of thorough pushback that is necessary here. And a lot of other content creators have covered these topics, these episodes, on their own shows. And while they have done a good job, they've definitely pulled up some valid criticisms in some areas, I feel that there's so much nonsense here that a lot of what Hassan says manages to slip through completely unexamined and unchallenged, I guess you could say. So I feel that we need to challenge them here. Because, oh boy, some of these opinions here are very interesting, to say the least. Let's get to it. So at the beginning of episode 58, Ethan and Hassan discuss the topic of socialism versus social democracy. Which one's better? Now, Hassan flounders around this topic, not really providing any answers at all, to the great frustration of Ethan and, frankly, me, the viewer. What answers he does give are often unrelated to the points at hand. See here the answer he gives Ethan regarding homelessness in Sweden. The question is, what does Sweden, a social democracy, do worse in tackling homelessness than a socialist state would? Let's see Hassan's answer here. Maybe I'm being too harsh on him. He could give a good one here, right? Let's see.
And that's just
before we look at those numbers, something to consider, something to remember always is that homelessness is tracked very differently in different countries.
Okay.
So like those numbers will always be, those numbers can be very different. Like you could think like, oh, it's so much worse. Like rape statistics in Sweden. If you look at that, I think Love can attest to this too. You'd be like, whoa, what the fuck? It's crazy out there. People are raping like crazy, and it's because they have a different methodology for tracking rape. Like each individual act of sexual assault is tracked as like is written up as like one
So
individual.
then the actual number then isn't that important, but we acknowledge that.
I was wrong. Clearly, I was expecting too much of him here. Now, this carries on for a while, with Hassan continuing to not really answer any questions properly. They then proceed on, and eventually the discussion turns to the topic of re-education? Now, this started when Ethan asked the following question to Hassan.
things
So what I want to say was this then.
But
If you're in a socialist country with multiple parties, and one of the parties is a capitalist party, which would surely exist,
Yeah.
what would you do if that party started gaining momentum? And it was clearly like people wanted that route. They wanted that route.
Yeah.
So what do you do?
So, to summarize, Ethan is asking Hassan, in his ideal system, what would happen to those who want change back to a more capitalist mode of existence? Ethan also implies that this would be done through normal political channels and advocacy. You know, things like writing letters, starting political parties, protesting, etc. Nothing that would be considered criminal or violent.
yes, the solution to that would always be education and offering more
Re-education?
re-education. Certainly, yeah.
Every time I hear that answer, I cringe. What really does it is how Hassan clearly thinks he's giving a great answer here, and how he thinks that his clarification
I know that that's like a
Let's put
trigger
them in
word.
camps.
No, not like that. I know there's a
actually somehow makes his point any better. So let's try and examine this one. Because, believe it or not, it actually gets worse the more you think about it. To do this, we will look into the example provided in the show and work it through to its logical conclusion. I will try to be fair and give Hassan's position the benefit of the doubt wherever possible. This will be done by assuming the nicest possible versions of any law enforcement, punishment, legal system, etc. As after all, Hassan is a principled leftist, and he wouldn't want, secret police or gulags here, so we won't add that into the discussion. However, even without all these things, it really doesn't make his answer any better, as you'll see in a moment. So we start off with a hypothetical capitalist agitator in the newly minted socialist state of Hassanland. Let's just say that's Ethan Klein for simplicity's sake. Now, Ethan believes that the socialist government should go back to capitalism, and goes about agitating for that to happen. He writes letters to his elected representatives, he spreads awareness through public education campaigns, and maybe he even starts his own capitalist political party, or runs for office. Now, in Leftovers, Hassan sets out the punishment for this: re-education. Basically, Ethan is going to be taken away somewhere and imprisoned, after which he'll be forced to complete a socialist training course of sorts to try and convert him. Now, I will be fair to Hassan because this is his ideal world we're talking about here. So the police when they're talking to Ethan about his capitalist agitating here, they'd be super nice. They wouldn't, no police violence, brutality, they just give him a polite warning. Now, the courts, when he is eventually brought there, because we're assuming that Ethan's going to carry on doing this activity, the courts are also going to take pity on him, giving him, the judge is going to let him off initially, there's going to be lower punishments, fines, maybe, community service, etc. But eventually, as Hassan says in the episode, it has to be stopped. We can't let this carry on. So eventually, somehow, somewhere, Ethan is going to end up in prison. Now, since this is Hassanland, his prison would look like a nice prison. It'd be a Norwegian-style prison. However, this isn't really the point, as it doesn't matter how nice a cage is, it's still a cage. Ethan would not have any freedom of movement and would be cut off from the outside world. But this isn't the real issue. As to get to this point, something truly disturbing has occurred. Now, sooner or later, the question will occur to you, as it did to me. The question is, what law is Ethan being prosecuted under here? And the answer is terrifying, because in order to put Ethan in prison for this crime, Hassanland would have had to have passed a law that says that it is illegal to express certain opinions, and that the state gets to determine which opinions are acceptable to be expressed in public. This law could be worded in a number of different ways, but the spirit of such a law would always be the same. Now, this is a truly horrifying law, as it cuts democratic freedoms at a stroke and leaves Hassan Land only a few steps away from becoming a truly despotic, authoritarian state. It doesn't take too much imagination to figure out what could go wrong here with such a law being on the books. Like, imagine, for example, a certain faction of socialists gets into power. Not even right-wingers, not anybody else, socialists. Because, you know, socialists famously never get along with each other. There's constant infighting. So let's say a bunch of fanatical Marxist-Leninists gets into power. Now imagine that such a faction then twisted this law to say that anybody who does socialism that isn't Marxist-Leninism also deserves to be locked up because that's the wrong opinion. Or imagine they twisted it even further and said that anybody who criticizes government policy is also having a incorrect opinion and needs to be locked up. Yeah, as I said earlier, once something like this happens, any semblance of democracy is not long for this world in Hassan Land. Now, I bet a few of you will be saying, well, Unready, Ethan was a counter-revolutionary. He's dangerous. They had to deal with him. He's a criminal after all. But in the example that Ethan set out, he doesn't mention any of this happening.
One of the parties is a capitalist party, which would surely exist.
Yeah.
What would you do if that party started gaining momentum?
So he doesn't mention any criminal activities or violent activities as a part of this. He's just saying that they could advocate for change in the same way that you or I might in our current political systems today. Hassan, however, did not acknowledge this and still went in hard initially on the re-education line. Then he tried to smooth out his answer to make it seem more acceptable by pretending that, this is only for violent criminals and such, when they weren't talking about that. Ethan clearly set that out in his example, and Hassan ignored it and pretended they were all terrorists.
I mean, it depends on
camp.
crimes,
Yeah.
right? Like, are people committing crimes at the behest of this? Because if there's a socialist state and someone is doing like white terror, let's say, or someone is doing South Korean style purges of communists, which has happened historically in every country that America.
And despite how Hassan rambles on and on about how he believes in democratic values later on in the episode, see here.
My point is this, though. The way I counter that always is this. There's always going to be corruption. There's always going to be, bureaucratic red tape. There's always going to be nepotism. But I would much rather, if corruption is inevitable, I would much rather have a more just and more equitable, a more democratic process that at the very least by its very design, like in the union structure, offers tangible benefits to the workplace, the workers.
It is clear that he is either lying about this or he is seriously deluded about the actual implications of his beliefs here. Now, it is possible that he's doing this as a meme or some kind of joke here, but it isn't really clear, as his manner when talking about this subject is identical to how it is throughout the rest of the episode. He also hasn't clarified at any point since the show has been filmed that he's joking or, he was doing a bit or whatever. Either way, whether Hassan believes it or not, his audience does. As I mentioned in the intro, Hassan has the largest political streamer in existence today, and he has a very large and devoted fan base. And spreading such dangerous beliefs to them, even as a meme, is dangerous, as it stands a good chance of radicalizing people into believing that this disgusting crap is actually legit. So yeah, not a good look from Hassan here. Very not good. But it gets better. We haven't even gotten to Tibet yet. Towards the middle of episode 58, the conversation turns from socialism and social democracy to foreign affairs. A long conversation begins to form around China and the actions of the Chinese government towards various nations such as Taiwan and towards their own people, such as their actions in Hong Kong and the whole Uyghur situation. Now this goes on for some time, with Hassan generally being on the Chinese side of this whole thing, until something very interesting happens. Let's take a watch.
Go ahead.
Tibet was literally a fucking feudal slave mandate, autonomous zone.
China did them a favor.
That was one. I mean, in America, when I say something like this, people get very upset. You know, we talk about the Dalai Lama saying "suck my tongue" or whatever, but like that's not far from the norm in fucking normal Tibetan existence before the Communist Party came in and
So
took over.
China unilaterally took over Tibet,
Like
squelched
these are
their culture. They basically are trying to, homogenize the culture.
if your culture.
They're trying to squell the religion and the identity.
The part of
And they did them
feudal
a favor.
warlords and slavery, abolishing that. Yes, I do think that is good.
No, China did them a favor.
I think that yes, I will
Doesn't
be
matter.
on the record
Just
to
like
state
America did it.
that
Nah, I'm
while
not
the
gonna say
Chinese
it.
government
I'm not going to say it.
So in that clip, Hassan talks about Tibet and what he thought of the Chinese actions there, and his conclusions were rather shocking, let's say. Now Hassan, without a trace of irony, invokes the old colonialist myth of the civilizing mission. Now you've probably heard of this before, just not by this name. Basically it goes a little like that one song in Pocahontas. That's right. It's the idea that indigenous people are savage and that they need a more advanced culture to come along and rescue them from their own savagery for their own good. Now, Hassan mentions in this clip that the previous Tibetan government was an absolute monarchy and implied that culturally Tibetan people are all, how do I put this? TOS. He implies that they're all culturally a little too into children, if you get what I mean. Like, it wasn't just me who heard that, right? With the whole, that situation. Anyway, let's move away from that. But he definitely does assert the Tibetan government was up to no good. Now, I could get into a complex discussion of cultural norms and moral relativism, and is it right for another culture to invade another one to stop an atrocity. I feel that would just bog down this whole video and just frankly be really boring. So let's make it simple. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Hassan is completely correct about Tibet. In fact, let's just say that Tibet was rotten to the core evil before the Chinese invasion. Let's say that Tibet was run by a reanimated Adolf Hitler and his army of Nazi zombies. Make it real simple. Break it down to a cartoonish level. So surely in this situation, the Chinese government invading Tibet and annexing it would be a good thing, right? Right? Surely. Now, if they did just do that, there could be an argument you could make regarding this. But that isn't what they do, and that isn't what they did, rather. And to really explain why, I've got to get into the history between the two nations. To set the scene a little, the relationship between China and Tibet is not as well known to many people as, say, the situation in Hong Kong. And this is because so many of the key events of this relationship have taken place in the mid-20th century, in about the 1950s, and not as many people are aware of things in that time period, particularly in Asia, and anywhere that isn't, Western Europe or America. Additionally, China keeps a very tight lid on Tibet and strictly controls the flow of information from within Tibet to the outside world. So much so that what limited information we have on Chinese activities in Tibet is only limited to what Tibetan dissidents and international journalists can smuggle out. So I'll give you a brief rundown of what has occurred between the two states throughout the years. Now, on the 7th of October 1950, the People's Republic of China, or PRC, invaded and annexed the neighbouring nation of Tibet. The PRC had long believed that Tibet should be a part of China and had finally made good on that promise. The Tibetan government was left mostly intact in the west of the country, but the eastern regions of Tibet were under Chinese control until 1959, when the Tibetans revolted against the Chinese occupation. After which, the Tibetan government was disbanded and hundreds of thousands of Tibetans, including the Dalai Lama, fled to neighbouring India. Now, from this point onwards until the present day, the Chinese government has cracked down on Tibetan culture and religion. They have repeatedly attempted to destroy Tibetan culture by limiting the practice of Buddhism and setting up residential schools in Tibet, in which Tibetan children are removed forcibly from their parents and put into boarding schools with the aim of isolating them from their culture. with the hope of destroying it forever. Additionally, large amounts of Han Chinese settlers have been imported into Tibet with the intention of displacing the current inhabitants who were living there, in an attempt to further isolate the Tibetan people from not just their culture, but their land as well. Anyone who protests against this is met by brutal police violence. In 2008, such protests led to the killing of over 400 Tibetans, whose protests against the Chinese government were met with police attacking them with electric cattle prods, tear gas, and live ammunition. This is not liberation by any means. Even if the old government was bad, the Chinese have replaced it with one that is just as terrible in every way. The only thing that changed was the flag. Indeed, the Chinese annexation here is frankly blatant colonialism, one which Western powers such as the British Empire have engaged in centuries past. To give an example, clear parallels can be drawn between the Tibetan system of residential schools and the one that operated in Canada. From 1880 to 1996, around 150,000 Indigenous Canadian children were educated in these institutions, usually set up by a combination of government and religious bodies such as the Catholic Church. The intention of these institutions was to destroy Indigenous culture and replace it with the culture of the Europeans, as these quotes by former Canadian Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald illustrate rather well. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who has learned to read and write. Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. In addition to their disgusting mission statement, these institutions were poorly run, with a tremendous amount of sexual and violent abuse taking place within their walls. Over 3,000 children died in these institutions due to a combination of malnourishment, lack of proper healthcare, and violence. Additionally, the education these places was provided were often inadequate and left Indigenous people without the necessary education to succeed. The curriculum that was forced upon these students also removed their native culture, forbidding them from speaking their own languages, for example, and not allowing them to be taught the traditions of their ancestors. In 2021, PBS News interviewed Heather Beard, a vice chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous First Nations, which represents 74 First Nations in Saskatchewan. She is also a former student of the residential school system in Canada, and I thought it'd be best to let her summarize the impacts of these schools in her own words.
Vice Chief Beard, thanks so much for being with us. I understand you went to one of these schools. What can you tell us about your experience and what it was like?
This has shaken our country, not only First Nations, but many non-First Nations, government leaders, professionals, and I think just every corner of our country has now been impacted with this new awareness that is not new. This has always been, these stories have all been told. What's coming out with this is the real story, and we need to change that legacy because it's a very dark legacy, a dark history of First Nations when we talk about the abuse and the horrendous crimes against children.
So, simply put, these schools are horrific examples of the worst kind of settler colonialism. The same kind of settler colonialism that Hassan spends all day ranting and raving about on his stream. And I know that he is aware of the residential school system, as he has covered it before.
Leads the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation and was among...
Just a little bit of kidnapping, a little bit of murder too inside of the residential schools, you know, basic stuff.
So the fact that he would miss the obvious parallels between the Tibetan annexation and other forms of colonialism done by Western powers is absolutely baffling. Just as a side note, in addition to this, the information blackout present in Tibet really limits what we know about these schools, institutions, whatever you want to call them. There's a good chance, knowing the Chinese government, that they may be even worse than the Canadian versions, which is just... Oh, that's something to think about, let me tell you. But this doesn't matter to Hassan. In fact, he utilizes the same defense of the civilizing mission that many Western imperialists have utilized for centuries with no hint of irony whatsoever. Now, I know a lot of you Hassanabi heads watching, and I know because I used to be one, embarrassingly, you'll be saying, "Unready. Hassan isn't using right-wing talking points. You've just talked about past colonialism. You haven't identified any points that Hassan is using." Well, okay. I have done that, actually. I've demonstrated where Hassan has missed the rather obvious connection between Western imperialism, which he hates, and the colonialism and imperialism practiced by China and Tibet. But, okay, let's pretend I didn't do that. I'll give you another example. Remember that clip of Hassan talking about the Tibetan people?
That was one, I mean, in America, when I say something like this, people get very upset. You know, we talk about the Dalai Lama saying, "suck my tongue" or whatever, but...
Yeah, that one. The one where he implies Tibetans are all culturally, you know, I don't have to say it. Well, let's compare that to a video from the Daily Wire made about Columbus Day in 2017. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole thing, as the Daily Wire actually had to apologise and remove the video for it being far too racist to be aired. Now, if it's too racist for Ben Shapiro, I don't really want to risk publishing too much of it here. However, I think this little segment really is illustrative of the similarities between the Daily Wire's position on Native Americans and Hassan's own position on Tibetans pre-1950. Let's take a look. So, just to clarify for anybody who's unsure, this little video snippet illustrated the things that the Daily Wire thought that indigenous American cultures had achieved before the arrival of European settlers, which was basically summed up as cannibalism, tomahawks, and dream catchers, whereas the Europeans get all the good stuff attributed to them, which I don't even have to explain how ridiculously racist and disgusting this is. Now, this isn't really that far from Hassan's claims about Tibet. Remember, Hassan claims that all Tibetans pre-1950, pre-Chinese colonialization, were all slave-mongering pedophiles, so they deserved Chinese annexation. And the Daily Wire claims in their video that Native Americans were all cannibals who liked tomahawks and dream catchers, so they deserved all the horrors of their colonialization from the Europeans as well. Do you not see the similarities here? The argument is the exact same. It is, they are savages, they are subhuman, and therefore they deserve to be conquered by a more advanced culture. And anything that happens after that conquering, they deserved it because they were savages. This makes my blood boil, man. It's frickin' disgusting. Absolute L from Hassan on this one. Now, before we finish up here, I just wanted to go over some of the smaller points that Hassan makes in these episodes that I haven't covered yet. Now, these were points that I didn't feel had enough meat on their bones, so to speak, to make into a full section, but I just felt we should mention them anyway because of how stupid they are. Now, first we have Hassan's comments on Ukraine from episode 58, namely this bit.
Real actors here.
You think Ukraine should make some secessions to Russia?
I think the original 6-point plan that was a continuation of the Minsk Accords that were tried twice and failed twice would be a far preferable situation than like endless bloodshed over, inches of territory.
What the hell does that even mean? I mean, technically it applies, as the war in Ukraine isn't over yet, so yeah, any bloodshed is by definition endless, and sure, the 42,000 square kilometers that are involved in this fighting can be classified as inches, I guess. You can convert kilometers to inches, sure. But beyond being technically correct, this is such an oddly unhelpful statement. Seriously, that description, rivers of blood over inches of territory, is so vague, and you could apply it to any war in history. American Civil War, World War One, World War Two, Vietnam, frickin' Peloponnesian War, you get my point. Any war you could apply this to. And can you imagine asking people in other wars in history to surrender for this reason? Imagine walking up to the Allied soldiers on Normandy Beach, or the Russians after they were just done fighting the Germans off of Stalingrad and saying, hey guys, you need to surrender because, you need to surrender to the Nazis. You're just committing endless bloodshed over inches of territory. Ooh. Like, how freaking stupid. Like, nobody would ever listen to this crap put in any other context. So, sorry, that one gets me. Next.
By like 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken, because that was a lease on Hong Kong. So the people of Hong Kong, there were certainly a lot of people in Hong Kong that did not want to be a part of the Chinese state. But overall, if you look at the situation in Hong Kong right now, it's like they claimed that it was going to be devastating, and that has not happened.
Not that we know of, because they have no freedom of speech anymore.
Okay.
Yes, this is another zinger from Hassan, this time from episode 58. Now, this time Ethan brings up the fact that many of the people who organised the Hong Kong protests that took place from 2019 to 2020 have disappeared without a trace. Hassan's reaction is to laugh at him and say, oh yeah, well show me the secret prisons.
You can just go to Hong Kong, and you can just go to every part of China pretty much and see for yourself. This is no longer like the North Korea style hermit kingdom where like no information comes out.
Like with Tibet, Hassan fails to connect the dots between the rather obvious points here. So let's do that for him. So our first point is that China is famously not very big on civil liberties. I hope I've established this in the last section, but I'll just show you how this extends even to their own citizens. Chinese police are extremely violent and brutal, whilst freedom of speech and general human rights are practically non-existent in China. A great example of this is Gao Zhisheng, Chinese human rights advocate and lawyer who disappeared on the 13th of August 2017. Due to his human rights activism, he had previously been arrested by the Chinese government, and during his imprisonment he was subjected to harsh conditions, including torture, by the Chinese government, which he detailed in a memoir in 2016, prompting the Chinese authorities to abduct him. He has not been seen since 2017, and look, I don't know what happened to him, but it's not good, man. It's not good. So given the fact that we know China treats its own people like this, and the fact that it has been well documented that many of the leaders of the Hong Kong protests have similarly disappeared, it stands to reason that a similar fate has befallen them. And like I said previously, I don't know what this is exactly, but I'll bet my bottom dollar it is not good. Now, the second point here, and I can't believe I have to explain this to an adult. Just because you personally haven't seen something, Hassan, doesn't mean that that thing doesn't exist. What kind of point even is this? More to the point, no, you can't just bumble around China stumbling into buildings until you locate the secret black sites where they take their political prisoners. These places are meant to be well hidden and well disguised. And even if you found them, I have a sneaking suspicion they wouldn't just pose for a photo shoot whilst you walk around the facility taking pictures. No, you moron, they'd make you disappear as well. So yeah, not a lot of information is going to come out from places like these, is it? Hence, people disappearing without a trace. Again, the idiocy from Hassan on this one is astounding. Next.
Them more. I don't think Yemen,
Yeah,
and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I just don't think Yemen affects.
But it's still people. There's still people that
No,
are being mercilessly slaughtered, whereas no one is being
not-
slaughtered in Taiwan in a similar capacity, and yet there are way more passionate because,
Not saying it's
like
right or
you
wrong.
said,
I mean,
it is designed to have this kind of.
and you think that if the only
Manufacturing
reason
consent.
people care about Ukraine is because of the media,
Absolutely, 100%.
nobody would care.
Yeah, of
Did
course.
anybody care about Georgia?
Yeah, that's a great
Probably,
question.
I don't know.
No one gave a shit about Georgia. That's crazy.
Finally, this last one comes from Leftovers episode 57 again. Now, H3H3's producer Dan helps Hassan defend this take. So basically Hassan and Dan are arguing that America, and the West generally, doesn't actually support Ukraine, and the only reason anyone supports it is because of mainstream media propaganda, which has created manufactured consent. After all, that's why no one supported Georgia in the, Russo-Georgian War of 2008. Now, just as an aside before we get into the actual topic, I'm 23, and I actually do remember the Russo-Georgian War. I was about 8 at the time, but as a young kid who was into war-related things, I remember it, and it sticks out of my memory, as coming on the news. It was on for about a week, and it was a significant topic of discussion around my household. And as I recall, we did support Georgia. We wanted them to win. So this bollocks of, oh yeah, nobody ever heard about the war and no one ever supported the Georgian people was utter crap. Sorry, I just wanted to get that off of my head because it was bugging me how they said that. Like, people cared. I heard about it in New Zealand on the other side of the frickin' world from it. So people heard about it and people cared. Back on point. The problem with Hassan and Dan's statements here is that, again, they are so vague that they're just unhelpful. What are they saying about the media? Are they implying that there's a secret cabal of Illuminati members giving the media their marching orders? Are they saying that CNN sends out delta waves that hypnotize anyone watching their broadcasts into agreeing with them? Really? What? Because without any kind of clarification, this claim is unhelpful. There are legitimate criticisms of the media that you can make, but this ain't it, Chief. The only thing I can conclude here is that Dan and Hassan see the news reporting on Ukraine, which is relatively above board and honest actually as far as the news goes these days, and conclude that because it is saying things that they don't like, the only reason that people agree with it is because of propaganda. Just like the right wingers Hassan hates on stream all day. If reality doesn't fit my opinion, then it's not me who's wrong, it's reality. Classic. Now, this sort of claim would be fine if, and this is a big if, Hassan and Dan had any proof to back up their claims. As if you're going to make these claims, you need to have the receipts. Now, these could look something like this. You could say, on this day, at this time, CNN reported on this particular Ukrainian story, and they misrepresented it like so. Here is the real story, which doesn't match up. Therefore, CNN lied and has spread lies on air. This is what you have to do to prove this kind of thing. You can't just throw around terms like manufactured consent and scream, "Trust me, bro," at anyone who doesn't agree. But they don't do that, and instead they end up making fools of themselves again, by essentially saying that people can't have different opinions to them, and if they do, it must be propaganda. Frustrating as always. So to sum up, Hassan's arguments throughout these 2 episodes of Leftovers are just awful. Being factually incorrect and morally disgusting. It's extremely disappointing that this guy is the largest political streamer in existence and has the biggest audience out of anybody in that space. This guy, who runs defense for blatant colonialism of authoritarian regimes using the same arguments that Western imperialists have used for centuries, whilst at the same time advocating for authoritarianism to be born within Western nations. This is why I feel that these points are so important to push back on for me, as hopefully someone in Hassan's audience might see this video and hopefully reconsider whether they still want to watch Hassan's content. Well, hey, that's all from me. I hope you learned something today. If you like this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.